By the middle of July, a lot of cool season lawns start looking washed out, not brown and dying, just dull, pale, and tired looking, compared to the deep green they had back in May. The instinct almost everyone has is to reach for a bag of fertilizer, figuring the grass just needs feeding, and that instinct is exactly what gets a stressed summer lawn into real trouble, since pushing nitrogen onto heat-stressed grass forces new growth the plant cannot actually support while it is trying to survive the season. What your lawn actually wants in July is not more nitrogen at all. It is iron, and the difference between the two matters a lot more than most people realize. Quick note before we get into it, since this is exactly the kind of thing people ask me about constantly. If you are tired of guessing what to put down each month and ending up with a lawn that looks worse instead of better, I wrote a short ebook that walks you through your specific grass type, month by month, so you always know exactly what to use and when. Scan the QR code on screen, or check the link in the description if you want a copy. Now, let's get into the iron. Cool season grass, meaning fescue, bluegrass, and ryegrass, spends the middle of summer in a defensive posture. Once daytime temperatures sit consistently in the 80s and above, the plant shifts its energy towards survival rather than growth, pulling resources down into the roots and crown instead of pushing out new leaf tissue. Nitrogen is exactly the nutrient that forces leaf growth, which is great in spring and fall when the plant has energy to spare, but in the middle of a heat wave it works against the plant instead of for it. A lawn that gets a dose of high nitrogen fertilizer in July often responds by pushing out a burst of tender new growth it cannot properly support, burning through stored energy reserves it needs to survive the rest of the summer, and that new tender growth is also more vulnerable to fungal disease in hot, humid conditions. This is exactly why most fertilizer labels and university extension guides recommend holding off on nitrogen applications to cool season grass once temperatures are consistently in the 80s, and waiting until early fall when the plant is ready to use that nutrient for growth again. Warm season grasses like Bermuda, Zoysia, and St. Augustine handle summer nitrogen better since they are actively growing in the heat rather than fighting it. But even those grasses run into burn risk once temperatures climb above roughly 90 degrees, so caution still applies across the board in the hottest stretch of summer. There is also a secondary risk worth knowing about, since that burst of soft, tender new growth that nitrogen forces is genuinely more susceptible to fungal diseases like brown patch, which thrive in exactly the hot, humid conditions most lawns face in July. Feeding a stressed lawn nitrogen in the middle of summer essentially hands a foothold to disease at the same time it drains the plant's own energy reserves, which is a rough combination for a lawn that is already working hard just to stay alive through the heat. This is where iron comes in, and it solves a completely different problem than nitrogen does. Iron is a micronutrient, meaning plants only need it in small amounts, but it plays an outsized role in one specific job, chlorophyll production, which is the pigment that gives grass its green color and drives photosynthesis. A lawn can have completely adequate nitrogen levels and still look pale and washed out if it is running low on available iron, a condition called iron chlorosis, and this shows up constantly in the middle of summer, because heat and dry soil conditions make iron harder for roots to absorb even when there is technically enough of it in the ground. The advantage of feeding iron instead of nitrogen in July is that iron does not force new leaf growth the way nitrogen does. It works by boosting chlorophyll production in the leaf tissue the plant already has, which means you get a visibly greener lawn without asking a heat-stressed plant to grow faster than it safely can. Turf researchers and golf course superintendents have used this exact distinction for decades, applying iron through the hottest months specifically because it delivers color, without the growth flush and added disease risk that summer nitrogen carries. That deep, almost unnaturally rich green you see on a televised golf course in the middle of July is very often the result of a light iron program running in the background rather than heavy summer fertilizing, since a course that pushed nitrogen that hard in that kind of heat would be fighting disease outbreaks and mowing crews working overtime just to keep up with growth nobody actually wants during a tournament. Getting this timing right, feeding the right nutrient at the right point in the season instead of just grabbing whatever bag is on sale, is exactly the kind of decision the ebook I put together walks you through for your specific grass and region. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want to check it out. Before you mix anything, it helps to confirm that iron chlorosis is actually what you are looking at, since several different problems can make a lawn look pale in July, and they do not all have the same fix. True iron chlorosis has a fairly distinct look up close, showing yellowing between the veins of the grass blade, while the veins themselves often stay noticeably greener, giving the leaf a faint striped appearance rather than turning uniformly pale all over. This tends to show up first in the newest growth at the tip of the blade, since younger tissue has a harder time pulling in enough iron when the soil is not releasing it easily. Compare that to plain nitrogen deficiency, which usually produces an even, overall pale yellow-green color across the whole plant, rather than a striped pattern, or to drought stress, which typically shows up as a dull blue-gray tint, along with leaf blades folding inward to conserve moisture, not yellowing at all. A soil pH test is the other piece of the puzzle, since iron chlorosis is far more likely in soil with a pH above roughly 7, where iron becomes chemically locked up regardless of how much is actually present in the ground. A basic pH test kit from a hardware store, or a simple soil test through your local extension office, tells you in a few minutes whether you are dealing with a genuine high pH lockout situation or something else entirely. It is also worth checking whether the pale color is spread evenly across the whole yard or concentrated in specific spots, since iron chlorosis tied to soil pH tends to show up broadly across a lawn with generally alkaline soil, while isolated pale patches are more often tied to something local, like a low spot holding water, a buried piece of construction debris affecting root growth, or an area that gets noticeably less water from the sprinkler system than the rest of the yard. If the whole lawn looks evenly pale with no striping and your pH tests out close to neutral, the issue is more likely related to watering, mowing height, or nitrogen levels than iron, and treating it with iron alone will not solve the underlying cause. Chlorophyll molecules require iron to be built inside the plant cell, even though iron itself is not part of the final chlorophyll structure the way nitrogen and magnesium are. Iron acts more like a required tool in the assembly process, and without enough of it available, the plant simply cannot produce chlorophyll at a normal rate, regardless of how much nitrogen or water is available. This is why iron-deficient plants develop a very specific look, yellowing between the leaf veins while the veins themselves often stay greener, since the enzyme systems needed to build chlorophyll break down before the structural framework of the leaf does. Iron deficiency shows up more often in soil with a high pH, meaning alkaline soil, because iron becomes chemically locked into a form plant roots cannot absorb once the soil crosses a certain pH threshold, even when the raw amount of iron in the ground is perfectly adequate. This is exactly why some yards can dump bag after bag of a general-purpose fertilizer containing iron oxide and still look pale, since the iron sitting in that granular form may never actually become available to the plant given the pH conditions in that particular yard. Beyond just color, adequate iron also supports several enzyme systems the plant uses in respiration and general metabolism, which is part of why turf researchers have found that correcting a genuine iron deficiency can also modestly improve root development and overall plant vigor, not just the visible green tint most homeowners are chasing. There are two main forms of iron you will run into for lawn use, and knowing the difference saves you from buying the wrong one. Chelated iron, sold under names like iron EDTA, iron DTPA, or iron ETA, has the iron molecule bonded to an organic compound that keeps it in a form plant roots and leaves can absorb even in higher pH soil, and this is generally the more reliable choice if your soil tends toward alkaline or if you have struggled with iron products not working in the past. Plain iron sulfate, sometimes called ferrous sulfate or copperas, is the older, cheaper option, and it works well as a foliar feed in most soil conditions, though it can become less available in very alkaline soil, and carries a somewhat higher risk of leaf burn if applied too heavily or during hot conditions. Cost-wise, plain iron sulfate is usually the cheaper route, often available as a simple bagged garden product for somewhere around $10 to $15, covering a large area since only a small amount is needed per application. Branded chelated liquid iron products marketed specifically for lawns tend to run higher, often $15 to $25 per bottle, though you are paying for a formulation that holds up better in tricky soil, rather than paying for a fundamentally different ingredient. If a soil test shows your pH is on the high side, spending the extra few dollars on a chelated form is worth it, since plain iron sulfate may simply fail to green the lawn the way you expect in that situation. Among the chelated options, iron EDTA tends to be the most common and most affordable, working well in soil up to a moderately high pH, while iron DTPA and especially iron EDTA hold up in even more alkaline conditions but usually cost a bit more per bottle. For most home lawns without a serious pH problem, plain iron sulfate or a basic EDTA chelate handles the job just fine, and there is rarely a need to reach for the most expensive specialty formula on the shelf unless a soil test specifically points you toward a stubborn high pH situation. Both forms are widely available at hardware stores, garden centers, and farm supply stores, usually sitting near the fertilizer section under names like lawn iron, liquid iron, or simply iron sulfate, so there is rarely a need to special order anything or hunt down a specific brand to get started. For a general foliar greening application using plain iron sulfate, dissolve about 2 tablespoons of iron sulfate into 1 gallon of water, stirring until it is fully dissolved with no gritty residue left at the bottom. That gallon covers roughly 1,000 square feet at a light color-boosting rate, so scale up the batch proportionally for a larger lawn rather than increasing the concentration per gallon, since a stronger mix raises the risk of burning the grass rather than giving you better color. If you are using a premixed chelated liquid iron product instead, follow the rate printed on the bottle, since concentration varies quite a bit between brands, but most fall somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 ounces of concentrate per gallon of water covering roughly 1,000 square feet. It is worth doing a quick calibration check on any hose end sprayer before your first full application, since dial settings on cheaper sprayers do not always deliver exactly what the label claims, and running a measured amount through the sprayer over a known area first tells you whether you need to adjust the dial to hit the intended rate. Pour the mixture into a hose end sprayer or a pump sprayer and apply it evenly across the lawn in a steady, overlapping pattern, since uneven coverage shows up as visibly striped or patchy greening once the color develops over the following day or two. Walking in straight, slightly overlapping passes, the same way you would mow a section of lawn, is an easy way to keep coverage consistent, and marking your starting and ending points with a garden stake or a hose coiled at the edge of the treated area helps you keep track of where you have already sprayed on a larger lawn. Apply iron in the early morning or the evening, never in the middle of a hot sunny afternoon, since heat speeds up how the solution interacts with the leaf surface and raises the risk of burn considerably. Most guidance on this points to roughly 85 degrees as the rough ceiling for safe application, and if the forecast is showing a stretch of days above 90, it is worth waiting for a cooler window rather than pushing through it, since burn damage on an already heat-stressed lawn takes a long time to grow back out. Visible color change typically shows up within 24 to 48 hours as the iron gets to work boosting chlorophyll production, and the full effect is usually obvious within about a week. It is worth checking the color change in natural daylight rather than under artificial porch light or right at dusk, since iron greening can look more dramatic or more subtle depending on the lighting, and comparing a treated section against an untreated section of the same lawn in full sun gives you the clearest read on how well the application actually worked. The color boost is temporary, generally lasting somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks before it starts to fade, so treat this as a repeatable seasonal touch-up rather than a one-time fix, reapplying roughly once a month through the hottest stretch of summer if you want to maintain the deeper color the whole time. I have seen this play out clearly on a yard that had been getting a monthly high nitrogen feeding all summer trying to chase better color. Switching that single monthly application over to a light iron treatment instead, with no other changes, left the lawn noticeably greener by the end of the same stretch of heat, and without the ragged, overgrown look the nitrogen program had been causing every few weeks. Knowing exactly when to reach for iron versus when to hold off and wait for cooler weather is exactly the kind of month-by-month timing the ebook I wrote lays out for your specific grass and climate. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want a copy. The most common mistake is simply overdoing it, assuming that if a little iron greens the lawn up, a lot must green it up faster and darker. Applying too much iron, or applying it too frequently, tends to produce an unnatural dark gray or almost black tint at the leaf tips, rather than a healthy deep green, and that discoloration is a direct sign of over-application rather than something to chase for a more dramatic effect. The second common mistake is spraying during the hottest part of the day out of simple convenience, which is exactly the scenario that turns a color boost into a burned, scorched lawn instead. The third mistake is skipping a basic soil pH check when a lawn simply will not green up no matter how much iron gets applied, since a soil that is significantly alkaline may be locking up even a chelated iron product over time, and in that case the actual fix is addressing the soil pH itself, often with an application of elemental sulfur over a longer stretch of time, rather than continuing to dump on more iron expecting a different result. The fourth mistake, and one of the easiest to avoid, is spraying without covering nearby concrete, since iron products stain sidewalks, driveways, and patios quickly, and that staining can be difficult to fully remove once it sets in. A fifth mistake worth mentioning is combining iron with other lawn products in the same tank without checking compatibility first, since mixing iron with certain herbicides or fungicides can cause the mixture to bind up or separate in the sprayer, wasting product and sometimes leaving an uneven, blotchy application on the lawn. When in doubt, apply iron on its own, in a separate pass, rather than tank mixing it with whatever else happens to be on hand that day. It is worth being clear about the limits here, since iron corrects a color problem, not every problem your lawn might be dealing with in July. If your grass is actually dying rather than simply pale, meaning the crown and roots are no longer alive, no amount of iron brings that back. And the honest fix at that point is proper watering through the rest of the season, followed by reseeding or resodding once the weather cools. Iron also does nothing for a lawn that is fundamentally underwatered, since chlorophyll production and general plant health both depend on adequate moisture, and no micronutrient application makes up for a watering routine that is too shallow or too infrequent. It will not correct compacted soil, poor drainage, or a genuine nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium deficiency either, all of which need their own separate fixes rather than an iron treatment standing in for them. It is also worth remembering that iron addresses a cosmetic and metabolic issue, not a structural one, so a lawn that is thin from years of scalped mowing or compacted from constant foot traffic will still show those underlying problems clearly, even while looking greener from an iron application. Treat iron as exactly what it is, a targeted fix for color driven by chlorophyll production, layered on top of proper watering and appropriate seasonal fertilizing, not a standalone solution for every lawn problem that shows up in the middle of summer. Iron products, whether plain sulfate or chelated liquid form, are generally low risk to handle compared to most lawn chemicals, but a few practical precautions are still worth following. Wear old clothes when mixing and applying, since any splashed solution can leave a stain that does not wash out easily. Cover or avoid spraying near concrete, painted surfaces, and light-colored stone, since the iron oxidizes on contact with these surfaces and leaves a rust-colored mark that can take considerable effort to remove if you catch it late, though rinsing a fresh splash immediately with water usually prevents a permanent stain from setting in. Keep pets and kids off the treated area until the solution has fully dried, which typically takes a couple of hours, and store any leftover mixed solution in a sealed container out of direct sunlight rather than leaving it sitting out where it could be knocked over or gotten into. If you do get a fresh splash of iron solution on skin or clothing, rinse it right away, since it becomes considerably harder to remove once it has had time to oxidize and set, and washing hands thoroughly after handling the concentrate before you touch anything else around the house is a simple habit that avoids a lot of small, avoidable stains. I have watched this play out on plenty of lawns that look tired and washed out heading into a hot stretch of July. A light iron application, timed for a cooler morning rather than the middle of a heat wave, brought back a noticeably deeper color within a few days, without a single extra mow added to the schedule the way a nitrogen application would have forced. So to recap, if your cool season lawn is looking pale and dull in the heat of summer, the answer is not another round of nitrogen fertilizer, which only stresses a plant that is already trying to survive the season. It is a light dose of iron, chelated if your soil runs alkaline or plain iron sulfate if it does not, mixed at roughly 2 tablespoons per gallon and applied in the cool part of the day, giving you the deep green color you actually want, without forcing growth the plant cannot support right now. If you want the complete month-by-month plan for your specific lawn, covering exactly what to put down and when so you are never just guessing, the ebook I wrote is linked in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen to grab it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.